Decisions made in Washington can affect your portfolio every day. But what policy changes should investors be watching? Washington Wise is an original podcast from Charles Schwab that unpacks the stories making news in Washington right now and how they may affect your finances and portfolio. Listen at schwab.com/WashingtonWise. Decisions made in Washington can affect your portfolio every day. But what policy changes should investors be watching? Washington Wise is an original podcast from Charles Schwab that unpacks the stories making news in Washington right now and how they may affect your finances and portfolio. Listen at schwab.com/WashingtonWise. In an administration that has spent its first month signing one mystifying executive order after another, the order Donald Trump signed last week concerning South Africa stands out.
Now, U.S. President Donald Trump has signed an executive order to cut financial assistance to South Africa. He cited as...
This order had a couple of parts. One was a funding cut that no one is sure will actually happen. But then, the really surprising thing.
Yes, the executive order does the astonishing thing of giving political asylum to South Africa's white minority Afrikaner population at a time when actually political asylum in the United States has been cut off to just about everybody else.
Chris McGreal writes for The Guardian US, but he used to live in Johannesburg, report there. He was as shocked by this order as I was, but he says maybe neither of us should have been.
We've got an exclusive investigation for you tonight.
Donald Trump has been worried about whites in South Africa since his first administration, when he caught a segment on Tucker Carlson's show.
The president of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa, has begun, and you may have seen this in the press, seizing land from his own citizens without compensation because they are the wrong skin color. That is literally...
After tuning in, Trump tweeted at Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, said he should look into allegations that the South African government was stealing white farmers' land, even that white Afrikaners were being killed.
The broader issue of highlighting what Trump falsely claims is kind of racial persecution of Afrikaners has been going on for some time.
As an outside observer, I look at all this and I just think it seems so transparent, right? This is Donald Trump essentially taking sides with this white grievance in a former apartheid state. Am I being too facile here?
No, I mean, that certainly from Trump's perspective, it's a very simplistic view of the world. I'm sure he has no understanding of what's really happening in South Africa. I mean, to get a little bit into the nitty-gritty of what's happening here, for many years, white farmers have been being killed on farms in South Africa.
But isn't the murder rate quite high in South Africa?
Well, indeed, this is the point I was going to make. The key here is that it plays on an old fear from what was happening in Zimbabwe 20 years ago when Robert Mugabe unleashed what were known as the war veterans against white farmers who were murdered and their land was stolen as part of a political play on his part. The Afrikaner groups are essentially trying to make out that's what's going on in South Africa, and it's not. They are victims, these white farmers, of a very high crime and murder rate. And depending on how you do the calculations, they're actually killed at a lower rate than black people living in townships like Khayelitsha.
You're making the point that Donald Trump has had these views about what's happening in South Africa for a long time. Does it feel to you like in this second administration, his views are more front and center?
Yes, I mean, I think it's clear that, and you hear this from Trump supporters, one of their expectations was that this time he would come out full blast. And that certainly seems to be the case. And this is one element of it.
Today on the show, why Donald Trump is going full blast at South Africa. I'm Mary Harris. You're listening to What Next? Stick around.
Planned Parenthood Federation of America exists so that all people can get access to the sexual and reproductive care and education they need to make informed decisions about their health. More than 2 million patients a year rely on the services Planned Parenthood health centers provide, like STI testing and treatment, birth control, gender-affirming care, abortion, cancer screenings, and so much more. Right now, all across the country, reproductive health care and rights are under attack from public officials who are out of step with the will of the vast majority of Americans. The constitutional right to abortion, control of our bodies, and the health care we need has been stolen from us. And now politicians in 47 states, yes, 47, have introduced bills that would block people from getting the sexual and reproductive care they need. Planned Parenthood knows that equitable access to health care, including safe, legal abortion, is a human right. Right now, Planned Parenthood needs your help to protect access to health care. Donate today by visiting plannedparenthood.org/protect.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile with a message for everyone paying big wireless way too much. Please, for the love of everything good in this world, stop. With Mint, you can get premium wireless for just $15 a month. Of course, if you enjoy overpaying, no judgments, but that's weird. Okay, one judgment. Anyway, give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
At the center of this back and forth between the Trump administration and South Africa is a law called the Expropriation Act. It was enacted last month, and in very rare cases, it allows the government to take land without compensating the owner.
In fact, the law actually promotes a just and equitable compensation and then permits expropriation in very narrow exceptional circumstances, such as the land has been abandoned.
The Guardian's Chris McGreal told me that misinformation around this law is largely being driven by Afrikaner organizations. Afrikaners are white South Africans who are mostly descended from the Dutch people who colonized this place.
So the central claim being made by Afrikaner groups and those who promote the idea of a white genocide in South Africa is that the post-apartheid political dispensation is essentially a racial conspiracy against the white minority. That the whites have gone from being the oppressors to the victims. And there are a couple of things at work here, one of which is post-apartheid laws to try and readjust the balance. So to give you an example, whites make up just 7% of the population of South Africa, but they still own more than 70% of the land. And that goes back to colonial-era law in 1913, the Land Act, but also apartheid-era laws. And part of the existing policy and laws is to try and redress that balance. And you have broader American will recognize this, broader affirmative action programs to promote black education or education for people who were previously disadvantaged under apartheid, which is people of mixed race, origin, black people, people of Indian and Chinese descent, all of those who were discriminated against.
It's interesting. You're saying there are all these laws to kind of make things more equitable, but at the same time, you're also saying that a very small percentage of South Africa is made up of white people and a very large amount of the land is owned by them. So while these laws exist, it doesn't sound like a whole lot of people are having their land taken away.
No. And so what you see with these laws across the broad spectrum is that they've changed society in many ways. Black people have much better education and access to higher education, even though there's also massive unemployment amongst blacks. But land is one area where there has been little change. And, more than 30 years after the end of apartheid, it's a particularly sore area for a lot of people because the vast majority of the population, black population, is rural and poor, and they see the land still in the hands of whites. So, no, it's become a symbol of in many ways, what hasn't changed in South Africa and how whites continue to dominate the economy in so many ways.
So are Afrikaners actually under threat in South Africa?
No, I think that they've lost their advantage that they had under apartheid. And what you're seeing is that there's an attempt, particularly by Afrikaners, to rewrite history and make out that they are the victims of all of this. So, for instance, a few years ago, there was a very popular song called De La Rey, which is about a general from the Boer War.
For those who don't know about the Boer War, just give me a one-sentence explanation.
It was essentially that the British sent their armies to conquer these two white republics and essentially took their land, took their gold. And after that, the Afrikaners were very much second-class citizens under colonial rule. Of course, black people were very much third, fourth, and fifth-class citizens. But in that war, there was a General de la Rey who fights to the end, even though he knows he's going to lose. And there was a song came out a few years ago, and Afrikaners adopted this song. They were singing it at rugby matches and in bars.
De la Rey, sal jy die boere kom lei, de la Rey.
And it was very much portraying themselves again as victims, bypassing apartheid, bypassing all the advantages they'd had, and turning themselves from the oppressor into the victim. And that's how now many of them see themselves, as they are, again, the victims in South Africa, even though they've had all the advantages of those many years of apartheid.
You've reported about how South African culture is embedded into this second Trump administration, especially in what some people call the PayPal mafia, which is a group of Silicon Valley supporters who've helped usher in Trump's second administration and are now helping enforce the whims of his administration. So can you just explain who these folks are? Like, I broadly know Elon Musk is part of it, but then also people like Peter Thiel and David Sachs, who my listeners may be less familiar with.
Peter Thiel was born in Germany, but his father brought him to South Africa when he was very young. He was educated in Johannesburg, but Thiel's father was a mining engineer, and he moved to what was then called Southwest Africa, it's now Namibia, but in those days was a South African colony in effect, where he worked on a uranium mine in a place called Swakopmund. And Swakopmund was notorious as the last place on the planet where people still openly supported Hitler. In fact, there's a New York Times story from the mid-1970s where the reporter pulls into a gas station to get his car filled, and he's greeted by the attendant with a Nazi salute and Heil Hitler. And it was a place where they still openly celebrated Hitler's birthday each year. Thiel goes to a primary school, an elementary school in Swakopmund for many years, which he describes as having been incredibly brutal. But that's the atmosphere he grew up in. You also have David Sachs. He was born in Cape Town, although his parents moved to Tennessee when he's 5 years old. But he still grows up in that kind of white South African diaspora. Musk was born in South Africa in 1971, which was really at the height of grand apartheid. It was the prime minister at the time was a guy called John Forster, who'd actually been interned during the Second World War as a supporter of Hitler and was a member of a fascist militia that used to burn Jewish people out their businesses in Johannesburg. So by 1971, he's running the country. So you can kind of get an idea of the atmosphere. They all become billionaires as part of founding PayPal. But they're also all libertarians and all big Trump supporters and helping to drive the philosophy of the present administration.
Can you tell me a little bit more about Elon Musk's family? Like, how did his family even end up in South Africa?
So his mother's side of the family, his maternal grandparents, are originally Canadian. And his grandfather, a man called Joshua Haldeman, headed the Canadian branch of an American movement in the 1930s called Technocracy Incorporated, which essentially sought to overthrow the democratic government of the United States under FDR and impose a business-led technocracy because they didn't like the New Deal. Haldeman headed the Canadian version of that, which, as the 30s went on, took increasingly fascist overtones with a kind of grey shirts and Nazi-like behaviour. And it was banned at the outbreak of the Second World War as a subversive organisation. And he was actually prosecuted and sent to prison for subversion briefly. And then in 1950, just 2 years after the introduction of apartheid in South Africa, Haldeman declares he likes the idea of that system. So Musk's grandparents emigrate to South Africa in 1950, never having set foot in the place, and become big supporters of apartheid. His father, Errol, has described those grandparents as open Nazis and supporters of apartheid.
So just to underline, Musk's relatives moved to South Africa for the apartheid?
They did, yes.
When he talks about South Africa, What does he say? Like, does he talk about how it informed his political viewpoints?
No, he doesn't. I mean, it's worth remembering that when Musk was in high school in Pretoria, he went to Pretoria Boys High, which was a mostly white school. There were, in fact, some black pupils in it in the 1980s, but it was a mostly white school. This was at a time of incredible tumult in South Africa. From 1976, you'd had the uprisings against apartheid in the townships. There was a state of emergency. There were mass civil protests. There was an incredible amount of violence, political violence. And this is what Musk grew up in and went to school in. And as far as anybody can make out, well, some of his schoolmates were very active against apartheid. He had nothing to say about apartheid, as far as we can make out.
He's reportedly said that he left South Africa to avoid serving in the military that was upholding apartheid. Is that meaningful?
Well, I hadn't seen that he actually said that, but he certainly left that at that time when he would have been obliged to do compulsory military service, which would have resulted in him doing one of two things, probably, either having to go into the townships to help suppress the uprising against apartheid, or to go and serve in the war in Angola, what was euphemistically known as the border war against both Angola and the Namibian guerrillas that were fighting for independence. He leaves the country on his Canadian passport just before he would have been obligated, as all white men were in those days, to do military service.
After the break, how Elon Musk's business interests may be fueling the Trump administration's targeting of South Africa.
Have you ever spotted McDonald's hot, crispy fries right as they're being scooped into the carton? And time just stands still. Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
At Don Miller Subaru West, we believe in being a positive force in our local community. Together with our customers, we have been able to sponsor and support local charities and nonprofits. Don Miller Subaru West has once again partnered with the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society of the Upper Plains region. Our donations have helped fund cutting-edge research to cure cancer and improve the quality of life for so many. Helping those in need, that's the Subaru Love Promise. Don Miller Subaru West, more than a car dealer.
You know, I hear theories about folks being motivated to behave in certain ways because of their childhoods, and it makes me slightly suspicious. Just because, I don't know, people grow up and they change their minds. Do you think Musk could have other motivations for why he'd be so interested in South Africa, tweeting so voraciously about it?
I think certainly there are business interests involved for Musk right now. For many years, he paid little attention to South Africa, and it's notable that he has started to latch onto this idea that whites are victims of discrimination, are being persecuted through a new kind of racist system, just as he's also been trying to get his Starlink into the country and run into South Africa's black empowerment laws, which essentially require black ownership of a chunk of the company. I think it's about 30%, depending on the business you're in. Musk is portraying that as a racist law, as a racist anti-white law, when, you know, it's a legitimate attempt to make sure that black people have investments in the economy and are benefiting from the economy as white people have done. But it's notable that Musk has ramped up this whole idea that there's, white genocide, whites are being persecuted, a new racist system, just as he's also trying to get the terms on which Starlink could do business in South Africa changed.
Yeah, tell me more about what this Starlink contract could mean for Musk and his businesses, and what it could mean for South Africa.
Well, the idea would be that Starlink, South Africa being a huge sprawling country with, large rural areas that are difficult to get conventional kind of internet lines to and all of the rest, it would provide some kind of service for farmers and for others who live in rural areas. So there would be a few $100 million, I believe, would be invested in this, and he would expect to get a good return from that. That's why we're going in to do it. It's interesting to note that he's being backed in this. There's a petition been raised by AfriForum, which is this Afrikaner rights group that's been accused of being essentially a white supremacist group, and which has done much to make the false claims of white genocide here in the United States and to push them towards Trump. It's now adopting Musk's language and saying that essentially he's being blocked because of his race, and that actually having Starlink in South Africa would help save the lives of white farmers who don't have good communications. So you can see now the merging of those two things, of this long-term campaign by AfriForum to persuade the Trump administration that they're victims of the post-apartheid order, with their direct backing now of Musk's business interests and claims.
Elon Musk and South African President Cyril Ramaphosa spoke by phone last week. Do we know what was said on this phone call?
Essentially, Ramaphosa was trying to get Musk to get Trump to dial back both the rhetoric and the threats and the cutoff of aid and all of the rest. I'm sure Musk had something to say about Starlink. We know that from before this, that the South African government has been considering allowing Musk to bypass the black empowerment requirement for black businesses to have a stake in his Starlink operation in South Africa by allowing him to invest in other kind of social programs to an equal value. So South Africa's saying, well, look, maybe we can work around that. And I would imagine that that would also have been part of the call as Ramaphosa tries to diffuse this whole thing.
I'm wondering if you can step back a little bit, because you reported from South Africa during the end of apartheid, right?
I did.
I wonder how that experience maps on to what you're seeing now in the United States as someone who reports from here. Like, is there anything that strikes you about this transition to this new administration where you think, like, I was in this totally different place. I can understand what's happening here in a way that maybe the people who've been in this place the whole time can't?
Yes, I suppose the closest parallel is with this narrative that turns the oppressors into the victims, I think. And you now, getting a narrative in the United States that is an attempt to say that people who actually are often been in the best position in this country are the victims, hence the attack on DEI, hence the attack on people who aren't white in general in some ways. So I think that kind of massaging of the narrative, the flipping of who is really at a disadvantage here, who is really in charge, is a clear parallel. But there are, I'm kind of hesitant to draw direct parallels with the apartheid system and years, because that was such a complex and individual thing to South Africa. What you have to remember there is that more than 80% of the population was black, and 8% at that point of the population was white, and they were ruling the country. So there are different forces at work here. I do think that the attack on the courts and the rule of law that may be emerging in this country, we're just seeing the first flickers of it with the reactions from J.D. Vance and others to the judge's orders on the various actions that have been taken by Musk and his Doge, may also prove a parallel in time.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. I see this administration taking aim at diversity, equity, and inclusion stuff, which is really, it hasn't been enforced with the full force of law. And what I see with the Trump administration taking on South Africa is a country that really has tried to grapple with explicit racism and what made apartheid possible, and do that through rules about Black business ownership and land ownership. And it makes sense that that country would be a target for a place that's going so aggressively after DEI,
Well, I think one of the things you see with Musk and Thiel and, others of these libertarians that emerged from apartheid South Africa is that they imagined that at the end of apartheid, it was some kind of level playing field and everybody was just beginning at the starting line and they should just, pull their socks up and get on with it. And it's an insane idea given the huge disadvantages that the majority of the population had, not least in education. I mean, Musk benefited from an incredibly good education in one of the best schools in Pretoria. And the idea that the end of apartheid meant that he was on a kind of, beginning at the same starting line as somebody who grew up in a black township just outside of Pretoria is ridiculous. But this is very much the idea that Musk and Thiel push. And I think you see the kind of domination of that idea in this country too.
Chris McGreal, thank you so much for your time. Super grateful to talk to you.
My pleasure.
Chris McGreal is a writer at The Guardian US. And that's our show. What Next is produced by Paige Osburn, Elena Schwartz, Rob Gunther, Anna Phillips, Madeline Ducharme, and Ethan Oberman. Ben Richmond is the Senior Director of Podcast Operations here at Slate. And I'm Mary Harris. You can go follow me on Blue Sky if you'd like. I'm at Mary Harris. Thanks for listening. Catch you back here next time.